Denver Nuggets hire Ben Tenzer and Jon Wallace to run the front office. Ben Tenzer hired as executive vice president of basketball operations, and Jon Wallace as executive vice president of player personnel. We've talked ad nauseum on the show about Ben Tenzer and his background. Check out any of our previous shows to learn more about, what he's been doing with the organization. He's worked with the Nuggets organization for the better part of 20 years now, almost, in various roles, including most recently as the GM of the Grand Rapids Gold, the Nuggets G League affiliate. Jon Wallace, on the other hand, is a new name that is apparently not so new. He is the former director of player personnel as well as general manager for with the Minnesota Timberwolves, and then he was also the general manager of their G League affiliate, the Iowa Wolves. Um, and he was also a former Denver Nugget in the role, quote, basketball operations associate, which sounds like the kind of thing that Ben did kind of earlier in his career, was kind of like doing it all, doing a little bit of everything, just helping people out with whatever the organization needs, basically. A lot of layers to this one, Will. First thing that I noticed in reading this was like neither of these titles are general manager, right? So what was your reaction to that sort of difference in how things are being structured?
I mean, just instant confusion and
I mean,
wanting
yeah.
any kind of clarification. And we did get some reporting, I guess, from Vic Lombardi. Even Adam Mares said he thought that the role was being split into two. They're going to be working collaboratively. Ben might be the business guy, Jon might be the player guy. And, we already had people in this role, or a guy in this role for vice president of player personnel, but he's also our head scout. And I'm like, so does that mean Jon's just gonna be a head scout type of role? Did we fire this other guy who was previously vice president of player personnel? It's the same job title. Then we got the report that they're kind of splitting duties. It's unclear what each are going to be responsible for, aside from the people who are kind of speculating on what it's going to look like. And we'll probably learn more from the press conference, which I'm very much looking forward to. But outside of that confusion, just not too surprised that it was Ben Tenzer and someone from Minnesota, though that wasn't the name that we were all like thinking. But
There
so
were actually
far,
multiple names from Minnesota that were apparently in the running, right?
yeah,
Because there was the Matt Lloyd name that had been floating around, who was the general manager over there and Tim Conley's right-hand man. There was also, I think it's John Corliss, who's an assistant coach there, who's rumored to be in the running for some kind of higher up front office position. We didn't know what, because it seemed like no matter what, Ben Tenzer was going to be involved. And we just didn't know what sort of level that was going to be. So I have a little bit of additional information to maybe give some context to this. Shams followed up his initial report here uh, with just an addendum here that says that both will report to Josh Kroenke.
which is kind of like saying
Yeah.
nothing because it's like everyone reports to them in the Nuggets organization. But I get that there's the extra flavor of placing Josh in this GM type or president of basketball operations role the way that it was placed with this report.
Well, apparently we have to be very, very careful with our titles here. You have to make sure that you refer to Josh as the executive vice chairman. Is that right? Of Crunky Sports Entertainment. Is it executive vice chairman or vice chairman? Whatever. Um, this is very different, and I agree with you that it just sort of signals this. We had all these questions about the like hiring the coach first, and now we're talking about two different guys that are kind of sharing duties within sort of running the duties of the front office. And yeah, you can try to split off some things like contracts and negotiations separate from players and stuff, but as I've talked about on our show, one of the gripes that I have with the way that they've been operating is that it doesn't seem like there's a ton of unity in the strategies associated with both. In that, okay, let's, for example, if you wanted to say, well, we have our player personnel guy that's going to be in charge of like setting the direction for like the types of players, like the way that we build our roster. So you want to draft and develop because that's what the Nuggets say they want to do. This is an example path. We want to draft and develop. That's what we're going to do. Okay. Simultaneous to that, you want to have some kind of strategy for what you're going to do when it comes to how they handle player extensions. Because if the whole point of draft and develop is to get good guys on good team friendly contracts, like you want to make sure that all that stuff, like, makes sense together, right? You don't want one side being like, "Well, we're gonna just be overpaying guys, or we're gonna be underpaying guys and pissing them off," and that, like, throws off the unity of the of the locker room and all the stuff that we're trying to build culture-wise, all this whatever. You want unity in that sense. Having 2 guys handling things separately doesn't necessarily mean there will be disunity in those things. Obviously, they're going to have to work together, collaborate, and come up with the path forward. But I just sort of don't understand why you have 2 different.
Yeah, I want to talk about that for sure. Some
Yeah.
comments I want to get to. HM Yiz says it was a weird way to structure the front office. Josh wants to be more hands-on,
That's
frequent
really
viewers.
that's the only conclusion I can come to because when you think about how I'm not saying that, like, one guy does all the things for the organization. Obviously, you need, like, staff under you and all this stuff. But when it comes to having key decision makers, it feels like this could have been one person, but they would have had to hire somebody that's more expensive, that has enough experience with both to make that work, and they didn't wanna spend that money.
Somehow the salary of these two will not equal the salary of one good GM, I guess. But
I or, like, experienced GM,
yeah,
we don't know, like, these guys might be good,
yeah, true.
front office
Uh,
dudes.
I think it would be fair to say, or at least the people commenting right now are not too happy. We have Red and White saying this is a disgrace for the franchise. Frequent viewer, Astrid, ownership's a joke. Given how the Nuggets are being run, lucky to win a championship. Yeah, I think people are just asking, why did it take so long to choose the guy everyone expected?
That's my first question, and that needs to be the first question of the press conference. It's not, and we were like, "Look, if they're trying to hire 2 important front office personnel at the same time, they wanna wait until they've got that finalized or whatever, like, fine." But my question is less about why it took so long to hire Ben, because there's no way, like, there's no reason for that. Why did it take so long to hire Jon Wallace from the Timberwolves, who, even if you wanted to say, like, this guy is just so integral to what they're doing over there that he needed to be in place until at least when the Timberwolves were eliminated from the playoffs. It was weeks ago. Following, at that point, we were already almost 2 months into the process, supposedly, of trying to find these front office personnel, and now Denver, I think, is, I mean, the latest the draft is in 2 days, Will. Like, do you know how insane that is? And they chose to do this. The last time they had even this order of magnitude of, time left before the draft, before they hired the people that were gonna run their front office. Sorry to cut you off. I need to get this one off here. Uh, it was when they hired Tim Connelly 10 days before the draft, and that happened because Masai Ujiri left at the end of May. That was not, like, their choice. They fired Calvin Booth in April, at the beginning of April.
HM is, I think people were under the impression they were going president of basketball operations and GM route. Yeah, that's same. But then, yeah, we have these weird titles, not sure what they mean. I tweeted that I feel like Josh is scarred from the Booth ordeal where Booth, yeah, I phrase it as power hungry. The fact that he kind of like had his idea of how he wanted to run the whole organization, wanted to reshape it, was in this Malone feud that we all heard about a million times. So he's
Got
splitting
some
this role up into
helicopters here. I'm
two.
not sure if you guys can hear
Oh,
that.
I can't hear anything.
Okay.
But he's splitting this role up into two, and I'm thinking like he's trying to create more checks and balances almost in these front office decision making so that things don't get as out of hand possibly as what Calvin Booth was doing. But it does seem that then that means Josh is more hands on than we even thought. Where I thought he may be hands on until the transition happens with the front office, but from then on he would be more back to ownership role. Might be a
Yeah.
little bit more involved than he usually is, but not to this capacity where I feel like he's seeing this opportunity to be like this president of basketball, GM, everything, panacea presence with the Nuggets, like he knows best and is taking this Jokic prime under his wing kind of thing. And I don't know if he trusts these guys to do what they do. We'll
Which is not
see.
great because you
He
just hired
might.
them, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I completely agree with you. Like I also interpreted Josh's, initial words as saying, at his earlier press conferences as saying, "Yeah, I want to be more hands-on in times of transition." So I was surprised to see this, especially the follow-up report from Shams about how they're both going to be reporting to Josh because I'm like, "Okay, where do you get this information from?" Probably Josh. Like so
Mhm.
it's like very indicative of what Josh wants. Um I don't think that it's great. Like, I agree with you that he doesn't necessarily trust these guys to do their jobs, which is, like maybe you wouldn't because they're inexperienced and for like first timers, whatever. Uh, but why would you hire them then? Like, this just kind of reminds me of, over the season where he's like, we're not going to extend Calvin Booth and he's going to be a lame duck GM and he's not going to be allowed to make any big move, which makes sense. You don't want to, but then it's like, well, why don't you just get rid of him and put somebody in that position who you trust to do their job? Right. It feels like Josh is going to be the most important of these three guys when it comes to shaping the direction of the front office and how like, what they do with the team, how they take the roster, and I don't like that.
It just seems like it based on this move that is going to be the case, but we don't really know exactly how this is going to shape out. Ben and John could be amazing at what they do. Josh could be there to support them and like okay moves and really get their input, but is he going to have an ego power trip thing getting in his own way? Are these moves just too risky having two guys who are fair to say inexperienced executives at this such a pivotal time? And I do not blame any fans who are very worried about these moves, but we don't really know until we see what kind of moves they make. Thankfully, we do have a draft coming up, which they could absolutely do nothing during that, but maybe they do make a move and we can start evaluating some of their perspective and at least we'll get some answers, though I'm not going to be surprised if they're vague as hell tomorrow, but possible answers on what direction they may want to go, especially like asking Josh why these guys, what is the vision they're
Why
selling
did this take
you?
so long?
I mean, yeah, that might be asked too,
And
but
that matters because we've heard this idea, Adam Maris has said it, other people have said, I think Josh or Jeff Morton, who we had on the show a couple of weeks ago, said like, look, they probably look at the fact that they don't have a draft pick, like that's ever mattered to participating in a draft as sort of permission to mosey on through this process. And that's worse than if they had something that had been, like, impeding them from whatever, taking place in, like, a thorough search for the front office. This is, like, just time wasted. And we know that they value this kind of thing. This isn't just me making up the value of, like, getting a head start on the off season a month or so earlier. We know that they value this in another context because Josh said, "Look, we wanted to hire DA right now." And they could have had other reasons for this, but this is Josh's stated reason is we want him to be able to get a jump start on hiring his assistants and letting guys know that whether they're gonna be retained here or not so that they can make other plans for themselves, but also so that DA can start liaising with like our current players. And like there's all this groundwork that needs to be laid early in the off season to help you, be successful later on. And now we're at the later on. Like draft night is like I said in 2 days, and it's not just the draft that's going to be happening on that night as we've iterated on this show many times before. Um so again, judging them by their own standard, disappeared for a second. Judging them by their own standard, I can say this is weird that it took this long for this move.
I know there was both sides of the coin. Some people were thinking because it's taking so long, it seems less likely it's going to be Ben because they could have just hired him if it was him. But on the other, you're thinking they're doing this thorough search and maybe interviewing some candidates that we haven't even heard about or throwing out big names, speculating on that. We end up not getting those names and it ends up being Ben anyways, with one additional outside perspective, which I feel like is a little bit of like a silver lining for some fans thinking, "Oh, at least there is some external voice being brought in." But it's kind of funny that he's still in the Tim Connolly
Former
realm. But
former Denver Nugget, by the way, external voice. Do the Nuggets and the Timberwolves know people outside of the Nuggets and the Timberwolves is what I'd like to know
we're just this separate ecosystem where we're just
from the
poaching
rest of the
things from
NBA.
each other and
Well, I don't
trading
know. The
people to each
Timberwolves
other
have managed to figure out how to interact with the rest of the NBA, and we're just kind of like, I don't
insularly doing the same thing.
feeding off of them, it seems like, because we were looking at 3 different Tim Conley guys for this job apparently, and then settled on this one who also happened to be a former Nuggets guy who was here under Conley.
Yeah.
Um, just
I mean, is there any
yeah.
chance that having a guy who is familiar with Tim Connolly, Tim Connolly, integral to the Nuggets early on in Jokic and Murray's careers, though he wasn't the perfect GM. I know we kind of like put the rose colored glasses on with him, but and then you have Ben Tenzer, who is familiar with what happened with Calvin Booth. Is there some advantage to having two guys who are familiar with both regimes and how this team should be built moving forward? Or are you just kind of,
So here's my thing is I'm not out on the moves. What
yeah,
I'm complaining about right now is this whole process. Like I don't understand. I hope we're gonna get some answers from the press conference tomorrow, but I'm gonna be honest that at this point, given how the last year really has gone, uh, I'm not gonna be holding my breath for that, for those answers. Um, I'm sure Josh will be more excited to answer questions about the front office this time than at the last press conference at
yeah,
TA's introductory presser, where he was very annoyed at getting those types of questions. But I really hope he is pressed on this because regardless of the kind of job that these guys can do, it seems like the organization, separate from Ben, separate from Jon Wallace, decided that they're punting on this offseason, which I don't know how that makes any sense even if you wanna go this internal development route. They're like, "We're not gonna like, that's not important," which is, like, not a great sign, by the way, if the person that's making that decision is gonna be the guy who everybody's answering to, reporting to, when it comes to, ultimate, roster decision makings, directional decision making, and all of that. It's like, Josh, like, didn't see this offseason as important in terms of roster building. He decided that, and then this process took almost 80
yeah.
days,
Because he's like, we're running
and
it
that's what
back
we're
for the
gonna
most
yeah,
part, was his message. So don't
and
have a draft pick. Is
yeah.
that a reason to take
Don't have a
that
draft pick,
off?
not gonna get a draft pick, we're not gonna do anything, like, I don't know, what it's not gonna be important for us to have our front office leadership in place because 'cause I'm
Here,
gonna take care of everything, and we're not gonna do anything anyway, right? So anybody that had sort of delusions that they were gonna do, participate in any sort of massive change, despite everything we've said on this show about how and what they've said, they're like, we're going internal development, we're not breaking up the core for whatever. Forget that. I'm talking about like substantive margin moves. I don't even think those are going to happen at this point.
yeah. I mean,
'Cause I just don't think they value them.
that's this. I mean, it's hard to imagine them not though, because it's like,
Because it's so absurd on its face. Yes.
but also it's like roster wise, that's the only thing we really can do if you're to believe Josh's commitment to the core four
Well,
is
no.
margin
The only
moves.
thing we really can do is hope that Peyton Watson gets better.
Hopefully that's not as they're
Hope that Julian
uh
Strother gets better. Hope that Jalen Pickett gets better. hope that all the other guys on the team are fine with that being the only thing that we're sort of banking next season on.
Here, HMU says that the Nuggets interviewed more VP of player personnel's Eric Amsler from the Heat and Director of Basketball Operations Chuck Hayes of the Warriors. So, yeah,
Interesting.
like I'm sure Josh will bring up the fact that he had interviewed multiple candidates. Probably is going to talk about how he wanted to take it really seriously. Like I imagine when people ask why so long, he's going to be like, we were taking this very seriously. You know what
You
I
know
mean?
what's
Like,
interesting about all of these names? I do want to talk about this while we're on it is I believe all of these people are associated with their various organizations' G League teams, which tells me that Ben's connections to the G League, because he was obviously the general manager of the Grand Rapids Gold, the Nuggets G League affiliate, is sort of part of what was guiding this search. Another name that was sort of thrown into the ether, I think RA Report was one that put this out, that Prosper Karangwa from the 76ers G League affiliate was also a name that was sort of in the running for some kind of position. I'm assuming whatever it is that when I say whatever it is, we don't know. The role has not yet been fully defined. That Jon Wallace is going to be for the Nuggets right now. These are all sort of this is a common name, vice president of player personnel and general manager of the team's G League affiliate. So that's kind of interesting. Um, what do you think about that? That according to HMEs, these were names that were under consideration as well. We have other reports that someone else from the like I said, the 76ers G League affiliate was also under consideration. And then ultimately we end up hiring the general manager of the Minnesota Timberwolves G League affiliate. Like, what is your sort of reaction to the direction it seemed like they were going as they were interviewing candidates?
the most optimistic answer I can give is they're some of the up and coming minds, you know, like these G League people who have seen
Right.
these
Josh used
development
that term a
players.
lot, this up and coming.
I think that's what he sees them as, and only time will tell. Like, I think he'll be like, hey, Jon Wallace has been around, like, he's really respected. And we have gotten, like, I've seen credible NBA people with sources say, or we're speaking very highly of Jon Wallace and his reputation in the hire. So, like, I, I'm like excited to see what he has to bring. And it's like everyone's got to start somewhere. If the Nuggets like get in on the ground floor of some, and just to be really optimistic, some like basketball genius, then that's great. But we just don't
I
know
don't know
yet.
about that. After Calvin, like I'm good. I'm good on all the basketball geniuses. I just want somebody who who knows how to manage a team and knows how they're gonna not manage a team. What is it called? The executive vice president a team. I guess right. Um, yeah, like I have no like explicit issue with, going after
Well,
somebody who is in the G League. A lot of that job involves a lot of networking. I've been to various like G League showcases before, and they're really just giant networking events. In addition to obviously all the work that goes into managing a G League team and all of this stuff, right? Just a little note here. I thought this was kind of like funny. So the Iowa Wolves actually came in dead last in the G League last year. They were 7-27 record wise. Does it matter? Probably not. Like not really at all, right? This is the G League we're talking about. But would we be hearing about it if they'd been like a top 4 seed for the last couple of years? Probably. Right? People love to put this kind of thing um on their not on their resumes, but this is something that you would like Josh would be bragging about it. I could see Josh bragging about it if it were, something to brag about. But I have no problem with that. I think that these are excellent networking opportunities. There's lots of scouts involved and all that kind of stuff. That's not really my issue. Honestly, at this point, I just feel like Josh has sort of limited these guys' ability to like conduct an off season. Right? Obviously, Ben has been in his interim role, so him less so, but it seems like Jon is gonna have the even more sort of consequential work in terms of the day-to-day. Like, they're not gonna be hitting the ground running, let's say, like, at the very least, and again, we've talked so much about the position that the Denver Nuggets roster is in because of their top heavy cap sheet and needing to manage things on the margins with a lot more care and consideration and just like nailing those margin moves, right? This is another thing about Josh is like, look, we are not going to break up with the core four, but also I'm not going to put these guys in like the best possible position to figure out a way to make this thing work that I've sort of constrained them to. Like that's pretty annoying as well. Like if we find out, weeks from now that like, oh, Luke Cornett was really looking for someone to reach out to him, but we didn't know who was going to be running the Nuggets front office. So he made a deal with somebody else and they feel good about that, position that they're going to be in. I don't know. I'm making this stuff up. But it like we know it can't help because they decided that having this time matters in the case of Adelman, but apparently did not matter in the case of the front office. Ugh, it's
Yeah.
just really frustrating the way that this all has played out. The last thing I'll say about John Wallace, we keep hearing is that he is a very sort of charismatic guy, like really good with people, really good with players, very well liked around the league. We'll see if that plays out. Obviously, that's kind of what you're going to hear after a guy gets hired to a position like this. But obviously, he came highly recommended enough for Josh to hire him. In addition to like Josh knew him, like he was literally here, right? This isn't somebody that they didn't know and had to just go based off of the recommendations. He was here for 3 years actually under Conley between 2019 and 2022 when he left with Tim to go to the Wolves. So
I mean, it's cool to have someone familiar with the Nuggets who's got outside experience. Again, you kind of have this weird mix of like familiarity, but maybe hopefully like a new perspective with him. But it's just, I don't really know much about him. But from everything I'm hearing, like it sounds really great. Just got to see how it goes.
shock and awe, shock and awe. All right. Last piece of Denver Nuggets news that actually is like a little bit of broader NBA news. Dario Saric opted into his $5.5 million player option. My note on this was just that it's a free $5 million. That was really never a question for me. Some people were sort of wish casting that he would opt out of his player option and go back to play in Europe, but he was never going to get that kind of money elsewhere. Denver can try to buy him out at a smaller number if they want to. The implication here really is just that Denver would be hard pressed to try to use the taxpayer mid-level and sign another veteran minimum player. Um, if he opted in, which he did. If they don't buy him out, just because they're gonna be hard capped at the second apron and they're, like, scraping right up against it. So I think it, like, that combination would put them just, like, $1 million over the second apron, which they can't like, it's illegal. They wouldn't be allowed to do that. So that's something to watch for. Um, couple of other player options, and then I'll get your reaction on that one. Dwight Powell from the Dallas Mavericks. In my piece on Zeke Naji's contract, I had a whole addendum about uh, the teams that have the most player options on their books, and the Dallas Mavericks, I believe, were tied with us and the Sixers for the most player options on their books. Dwight Powell being one of them. This one was interesting because they're one of the teams like us where a lot of these player options came after the new CBA was enacted. So it was like that doesn't really make sense to me. I don't know why they gave Dwight Powell a player option, but they did. So he opted into that. And Chris Middleton also accepted his over $30 million player option with the Washington Wizards. This was very expected. I was asking you, Will, before the show, whether you thought Chris was going to be bought out after the trade deadline or traded before the trade deadline. So maybe you could just give me your reaction to all those player options happening at once. This is like the week for options to be, either picked up or declined by both teams if they're team options or players.
I mean, I care the most about Dario's option, though we knew he was going to pick it up, but there was the small glimmer of hope. He could have declined it. But yeah, what are you
Murphy's
going to
Law.
do? Free $5 million.
Yeah.
I agree with HM is probably leaning towards a buyout slash being used in a small trade. I mean, how can you not want something like that if you're Dario? Like, I just can't imagine him playing or, sitting on the bench for another whole season unless DA has some other vision for how he wants to play Dario at the 4 versus a backup 5 or something like that. But I feel bad for Dario, but hey, he gets money, so what can you really say?
If
He
he
got an
lets me
extra
hold a
5 mil.
dollar, I'll feel bad for him.
Yeah,
Until
give me one
then.
of your dollars.
Huh?
Give me one of your dollars, Dario.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just like a lot of the Nuggets roster issues are like just these roster spots and some of the people that are holding it, as well as the finance aspect of it with like Zeke and Dario. But like, there's just a lot of like players on our team that can't play. So I don't.
One of the things I'm watching this season and this off season, frankly, because I'm looking at this Chris Middleton thing and I'm like, look, if he's healthy at the trade deadline, it would behoove the Wizards to try to trade him because he'll be just an expiring contract at that point. Lots of teams would want him as just a player that they can have. That would be useful going into the playoffs. Like if he's healthy, he's a good player. It's Chris Middleton, right? But if he's not, then it would make sense for the Wizards to just buy him out at the deadline, save some money from their books, and then Chris could try to like find a place on a contender as well if they're willing to kind of take the risk that he would like get healthy by the playoffs, that kind of thing. But because he makes so much money right now, you're not allowed to. The Nuggets would not be allowed to pick him up off the buyout market because they're over the first apron. And they're over the first apron because of the Zeke and Dario contracts.
No.
So I would be very annoyed if for the second year in a row, the reason that Denver couldn't just pick up like Chris Middleton basically for free is because Zeke and Dario are on their books. Um, so that's something that stood out to me. And yeah, I don't know how Ben Tenzer is gonna because we're kind of thinking about this like we talked about as Ben handling more of the I don't know, on the books side of things, and Ben has all these ideas, these like fresh ideas for how the front office should do things differently. I'm very curious about how they're going to manage assets differently just going forward. For those that made it this far, we really appreciate you, and you probably have already subscribed, but if you haven't, please hit the subscribe button as well as the like button. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our content, and always remember that winning is fun and losing sucks.